excited to have my returning guest, David Matheson. David, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you, Lindsay. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. I talked a little bit about kind of what I'm going through personally, what I've been working on with other people with energy work. And I feel like it's also a reflection of kind of what's going on with the whole of society. And so, but I wanted to have you introduce yourself, talk a little bit about, I'd like to know how you really got interested and how you started making these connections or what led you to um, into going deeper with kind of what's been hidden in plain sight and how that sort of evolved.
Sure. Well, thanks. And it is a very polarized time. We're obviously, and we'll talk about polarization in this conversation on some of the subjects that you wanted to hit on. So we'll just put a thumbtack in that and come back to that concept of, the world being polarized, but also within ourselves, polarization. We can get into those things. But, I've talked about it over the years on different interviews that I've been on, and I wasn't seeking out the connections between the myths and the stars, or at least between the Bible and the stars. I was always fascinated by the myths, even when I was very young. I was introduced to the myths very early. I read the books, the Dolaire books of the Greek myths and the Norse myths. And when I was in like first and second grade, we had these readers. I think they were called SRA. This was like in the 70s. You would kind of read and learn to read by filling in. They would have blanks and you'd fill in the words. And when you got higher numbered workbooks, they were all about kind of stories, and they would have Greek myths in there, and I loved those. So I was really into the myths, even from a very, very like first and second grade
Mm-hmm.
age, and also really into the stars. My dad used to take me out to look at the stars, and I used the books. He introduced me to the stars using the outlining system of H.A. Rey, who also wrote the Curious George books. He and his wife Margaret Rey
I
created
have
Curious
those
George.
books, by the
Yeah,
way.
you have the
Yeah,
star
those are
books. Yeah,
great.
they're really essential. And his book, it was first published in 1952, is called The Stars: A New Way to See Them. So everyone should have that in their house. But I would contend that it's a funny title because he says the stars, a new way to see them. You can show that it's actually a very ancient way to see them. In other words, his outlining system is the outlining system that is clearly being used in ancient artwork, in ancient pottery, in
Mm-hmm.
ancient sculpture, and in ancient myth. So it should be called The Stars, a New Way to See Them, which is also a very old way to see them.
The old way.
Yeah,
Well, I
very.
think that goes with a lot of different things. Everyone's like, even with this new age movement, they're taking ancient religions, belief systems, and sort of morphing them into this like new ageism in a lot of ways. But this is ancient knowledge that's been around for a very long time in every culture.
That's right. Yeah, and it connects all the different cultures of the family of humanity around the world on every inhabited continent and island around the globe. So, um, yeah, I mean, in defense of that, I'm not defending a lot of the stuff that gets lumped into New Age thinking, but in defense of that title, it is actually a celestial title. They're talking about processional ages. So as the
Hmm.
ages roll past from the age of Aries into the age of Pisces and then into the age of Aquarius, I think that's where, New Age is that transition between the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius, which we're basically on the cusp of right now.
Right.
Um, that whole great conjunction, a lot of people were saying, "Oh, that's the signal for the start of the age of Aquarius." And then I did a video about it, which talks about how Hamlet's mill said, you really have to have three great conjunctions in a new sign in order to be a new age. So it's not really the age of Aquarius just yet. But anyway, setting that aside,
There's
it is
definitely
very interesting.
transformation
Yeah,
going on regardless of whatever.
right. It may take a lot of conjunctions for it to shift, or it may be,
Yeah.
yeah. But certainly there's a lot going on, and certainly these concepts that are being talked about and referenced in words like New Age and in many other places are very ancient concepts. None of this, there's that famous saying, I think it was William Faulkner or somebody who said it, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. Well, the ancient times aren't over, they're not even ancient.
Right.
We're very connected to all these things. So I was very into the myths and very into the stars, but I never really um, made these connections between the stars and the myths. I became a literalist Christian. I was looking for things. So I went off to the military. I went to the military academy. I got into like the infantry and ranger school, and I was big into skydiving and kind of risk-taking activities. I was seeking for something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I got very into literalist Christianity, where I read the Bible very thoroughly, and I got to the point where on Sundays I wouldn't read anything that wasn't either the scriptures or a commentary on the scriptures, and I wouldn't
Did
watch.
something lead to that? I'm just curious. Like,
No,
was
I'm
that
trying.
just like a step of like joining the army that the
No, that was
just
it's
personal
searching.
path?
I would say it's searching. You're searching
Yeah.
for yourself. If you're
Hmm.
separated from yourself, you're searching for that, and you can search for that. We'll get into it maybe a little bit because you asked me to talk about, you know, last time you talked about trauma, and once we
Yeah.
recognize that, then what then? Well, what is trauma? It's separation from yourself. And so that's what we're all actually seeking for, is to return to recover that alienation or fix that alienation,
Yes.
recover who we really are. And so I think that's what I'm convinced that's what I was searching for. And you can find those answers in the ancient myths, including those that are in the Bible. I believe the Bible is about healing that, but it's
Hmm.
been twisted. It's been twisted into a literalistic interpretation, which actually inflicts trauma rather than healing trauma in many
Right. It's
cases.
another form of separating the self and separating your relationship with your higher self and God and source and all of the aspects of what you're searching for of being whole, right? It's a
Right.
fragmentation of self.
That's right. So, division from yourself leads to division from others in the human family, including your own family, but also the wider human family, separation from nature,
Hmm.
separation from the universe. So, recovering self leads to a repair of all those things. And that's really the stories in the Bible, as with all the other myths, can be shown to have that separation and that recovery at the heart of what they're talking about. That's one of their central themes, if not the central theme, because there's a lot of layers to what they're talking about, but that is one major theme. So I was searching for that. I was searching for that very hard,
Yeah.
uh, for want of a better adjective. I was searching for that very desperately. And so I really threw myself into literalist Christianity. But I always loved the myths. I had the opportunity to go back and teach at the military academy in the Department of English and Philosophy, and got to teach the Odyssey, which I had always loved since I was young. I loved the Odyssey. It's one of my favorite uh, pieces of literature or texts,
Hmm.
myths of all time still. Um, and It was only after I'd gotten out of the Army that I encountered the book Hamlet's Mill, which I'll talk about in a second. But I encountered it through the work of Graham Hancock. Um, a lot of a lot of Hamlet's Mill was a very seminal work. It influenced a lot of people. It was published in 1969, and I got a book for my mother. Actually, my mom and dad were going to visit Machu Picchu in Peru,
Oh,
and I
cool.
said, "Oh, what book can I, get for my?" It was my mom's birthday coming up, and I bought her a book called Heaven's Mirror by Graham Hancock and his wife Santha Faya, who's a brilliant photographer, and it's a beautiful book with, it's almost like full page glossy photographs of Machu Picchu and other ancient sites around the world on almost every page. It's really
Hmm.
nice. Um, and So I got that for her, and then I said, "Who is this Graham Hancock?" And I started looking into more of his work, and he references Hamlet's Mill. Graham Hancock is very famous, obviously, has written about the evidence of an ancient civilization a forgotten civilization around the world. And there's very strong evidence, archaeological evidence, and other researchers have talked about this too. Robert Schoch and the late great John Anthony West. But when I encountered Graham Hancock, so then I bought some of Graham Hancock's other books, like Fingerprints of the Gods, which is where he talks about Hamlet's Mill. So then I went off and got Hamlet's Mill, and Hamlet's Mill talks about some ancient system that informs our systems of measurement, of weights and measures, volumes and number, and a system that informs music. It's all connected, and it informs myth, and it is connected to the rhythms of the cycles of the heavens. And they talk about these connections between the stars and the myths, and I was just fascinated by that because as I said, I already loved the stars. I remember going out and looking at the stars when I was little, when I was in the Army. You get a chance to see the stars because you're out in the middle of nowhere sometimes in the desert or wherever, and it's, pitch black out. I always loved the stars. I always loved the myths. And when Hamlet's Mill said, oh, there's some ancient system worldwide which seems to inform all the myths, and they're connected to the stars. Well, I had to know more about that.
Right.
Unfortunately, they're not the best guides, the authors of that, Herta von Deckend and Giorgio de Santillana. They didn't actually have it all figured out. They just perceived the evidence around the world. They pointed to the evidence and said, there's something here. And for seeing that and tying it all together and saying it's all connected, but it's in ruins, they deserve a lot of credit. But they did not decipher the vocabulary or the structural outline very clearly. And so their book is very confusing, and it's because they are actually grasping and missing in a lot of, I've now realized that in a lot of their interpretations are incorrect, much of it because they're not using H.A. Rey. So their outlines of the stars, they weren't able to figure out the connections of the constellations a lot of times.
So when you say that, does that mean that they're matching myths with different constellations that don't quite add up? Or are you just saying that they missed all that together?
No, they did. Actually, sometimes they do connect it to constellations. And when they do, they're usually right. Sometimes they're not, but usually they are. But more of the time, they don't make the connection. They'll say, well, the reader,
like how big it really is.
Well, they'll say the reader can figure out what we're talking about here. It's quite obvious. And then they won't tell you. It's like, well,
Very
if you
vague.
know, why don't you tell? Yeah. But they will make some connections. They made enough connections. But the thing they'll do more often is try and tie it to the planets, because the planets have the names of the gods: Jupiter, Venus, Mars, Saturn.
Exactly.
So it's not wrong, but they put too much emphasis on that, and they try and make that system bear the whole. They don't understand that it's connected to
it's bigger.
The constellations. Yeah, right. So it's both connected to the planets and the stars, but it's more connected. It's really connected to the cycles. It's the cycles which are seen in both the planets and the constellations. But the constellations are a very powerful marker of where we are in each cycle, because we can see the sun and the planets moving.
We can see the moving of the constellations in conjunction with where we're at. And okay.
And so the whole system is a code or a gigantic metaphor in which those cycles have different meanings. But if you don't understand the connections to the constellations, then you won't actually be able to understand what they're saying too well. So anyway, kudos to the authors of Hamlet's Mill for saying there is something here.
Yeah.
They didn't, but I became obsessed with figuring it out, and I think I've unlocked more of the grammar of this ancient language than they were able to do. Like I said, they published in 1969. H.A. Rey didn't publish his system until 1952. So they clearly weren't aware. They could have looked at H.A. Rey's book, but just looking at their diagrams and their illustrations in the book, it's clear that they weren't using it. So they missed a lot because of that. But Anyway, I'm not putting it down. I'm just saying if you try
Oh
and read it,
yeah, I think it's
it's
given
just
like I just
confusing.
see it as like your opportunity or another person's opportunity to take that further and do research.
Right.
And then, with your books, I think you're translating a lot of in like filling in a lot of the missing information because I think that's with a lot of things. It's not just about these constellations or these myths or just belief systems. It's like we're only getting these snapshots of you can equivalate that to like what's going on in the world right now and the news that we're given, right? It's just so fragmented and we don't have the whole picture. And people that think they have it all figured out sometimes are, I don't know, kind of missing the bigger picture to begin with, as so I think that it's awesome to be able to be inspired by things, even um, and be able to kind of translate that in your own observations and do your own research. I think that makes it much more valid for you personally.
Right. And I totally agree. And what we're seeing going on in the news is not disconnected from this. Like I said, the polarization. There are people who deliberately are polarizing the people, both against themselves
Yes.
or traumatizing the people and traumatizing uh, groups of people, traumatizing nations and traumatizing the world and traumatizing and separating people from one another on
Yeah,
purpose
very
and polarizing
purposely.
on purpose. And it's connected
Yeah.
because, like I said, the myths I can show you, the myths are about healing. They talk about that trauma for sure. They definitely show that trauma, alienation from the self, is one of our, if not the most, one of the most uh, important things that we deal with that we have to fix. It probably is
Right,
the
it's
most
a root.
important
It's
thing.
certainly a huge part of the root because without it, it's hard to build any sort of trust or foundation within yourself, let alone you're very easily misled if that's disrupted. And I
That's
think
right.
that's
That's right.
very purposeful.
That's right. And so if the myths are about healing that, and they can be shown to be about healing that, and they're speaking this coded language, but it's about healing that, then how come we don't know that today? I mean, most people don't realize that that's what the myths are about, and that the Bible is based on the same system that the stories of the Buddha are based on, that the stories of the Native
Mhm.
American nations are based on, that the stories of Maui in the Pacific are based on, that the stories of the myths in the Kojiki of Japan are based on, that the stories of the Greek myths are based on, and they all have this um, common foundation. Well, how come we don't know that? Because somebody deliberately, I believe it was deliberate,
Yeah.
overturned that understanding and said, no, 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 they're just literal. And so that understanding, things that should not have been lost, as they say at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, were lost, were
Mhm.
forgotten. So and it was deliberate. So, so part of the reason why I was so obsessed by this quest, though, was that every now and then the authors of Hamlet's Mill would mention that the Bible stories are also based on this same system. And they would talk about the story of Samson, or they would talk about some of the images in the book of Revelation, the Revelation of John. And I would say, oh, well, I can handle that the Greek myths are based on this, but don't tell me that Samson wasn't a literal person because I know that he was, because I'm believing the Bible is literal. But anyway, the more I, it was almost like I was driven to get to the bottom of it. And as I got to
Yeah.
the bottom of it, I realized that, not only were they right about Samson in the book of the Revelation of John, but the whole Bible from Genesis to Revelation and everything in between is based on the same system, the same celestial system that's found at the heart of the myths of ancient Egypt, the myths of ancient Greece, all the way around the world, Australia, Africa, Norse myths, Maya. So so that's a long answer to your excellent question of introduction, but yeah, that's what my work is about now is exploring the myths and the connections between the myths and the stars and what they are teaching us. Because the more we can learn to listen to them in the language that they're speaking, the more we can hear their message. And I am convinced that message is a tremendous blessing. It's a tremendously beneficial message that they have.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I feel like, I've heard you say, and I think I've listened to you quite a bit on other podcasts, and then I've also, had you on mine last time, but mentioning that, you're not trying to insult those that really do follow religion. And I don't see that at all. And if anything, I would feel that this is a lot more empowering because it's bridging the gap of your relationship with all aspects of yourself and giving you the keys which you've already hold, but like giving yourself the permission to be your own savior. And I don't mean that as like that we're these damned beings, but people do feel that way on the inside, whether they're aware of it or not, regardless of what religion that they follow or not. I think that um just because you follow a dogma doesn't mean you're not fragmented, you know and doing everything that you're told that's been written literally is not going to give you the freedom that you hold inside from, I think, going deeper and seeing, like you said, these stories are all aspects of parts of ourselves that we're not really, that are hard to look at, that are hard to live with, but are the biggest gifts that we have within ourselves. Like what we push away becomes our biggest strength, becomes our biggest ally within ourselves, and allows us to be more whole and show up in our lives and, on other areas and aspects of whatever realm you decide to go in and venture in. It's I don't see it as like an insult to um religion. And I was thinking about this. I feel like, if people have a really hard time or this disrupts them so much that they're upset by it, one, don't listen, and two, what does that say? Like, that's obviously resonating something really deep within inside of yourself that is a trigger. And it wouldn't be such a trigger if what you believed was so absolute. It's like, I'm not I'm not saying follow what I do, but I try to be really open, even when I listen to things that I don't necessarily resonate with, because if I'm fighting against that, it's like, what does that say about my goals of being an open person and learning and being here to kind of experience it all? Like, that's just building up walls within ourselves. And you're only able to show up if you hear what you're able to hear without being upset, which in a lot of ways is like what the world is doing and what how a lot of people are acting like right now in present time. And that's just been really escalating. And that's why I reached out, because I'm like, man, this information is so amazing, but it's like, how, I know there's not one answer, but it's like, how do we save ourselves? How do we show up for ourselves? How do we look deeper within ourselves? I've thought about this. It's like, it's hard to tell someone that's been through the most traumatic experience of their lives that they're also the ones, like, these are their deepest allies of surviving them. But I believe that. I really do. There's a huge part of me that understands that we go through these for a reason. And I feel, especially when I listened to what you were talking about, I think the first time I heard you, it made the most sense to me, especially looking at ancient cultures and how people just are baffled how people from across the whole other world simultaneously were kind of doing the same things, building pyramids, just like having the same symbolism, having being able to align the structures with, like, the stars or the sun or the planets. And people were just baffled because they basically thought these people were inept because they didn't have a computer or a calculator to figure it out. And I think that we are so much more intelligent than we've been led to believe. So
Yeah, no, that was really well said. All those points that you made in there were very good. I appreciate the fact that you work with others to help them heal themselves, and so you have a lot of insight into these things. And I think outline that you kind of suggested for today's talk when you messaged me about it
Hmm.
really will lead us through some of those points that you just talked about, or allow me to kind of talk to some of those questions that you just raised about how do we, um, how do the ancient myths help us in this need for healing that we might feel that we have. I know, I just talked about how I was searching for
Yeah.
something. I was searching really hard for something, and I think that same path, that same searching that same path led to these areas that I've gone in, obviously, the discoveries and exploration of the myths. So, um, so what were the three things? I think last time the video, no, I know what they are, but do you remember what it is you wanted to talk about? Last time you wanted to talk about two different Bible stories, and we got to one
Yeah.
of them. We got to David and
Yes.
Goliath, and I think one of the best parts of that whole interview, the sound, there was a little glitch in the file where I asked you, why did you pick David and Goliath? And then why did you pick, what was the other one?
John the Baptist.
Right. And so we talked about David and Goliath, and you said it was because, he's kind of the underdog, but how can you overcome these when you're facing something that seems even too big to overcome? And that can play into today's conversation too.
Right.
Some of these giants that we have to wrestle with, within ourselves as well. So you talked about why you wanted David and Goliath, and why was it that you wanted John the Baptist? You
Well, I think just the drive, like the obsession of just this need of, and to me, that's almost like, the searching that we have inside of ourselves, and how, John, I think that, if we don't honor these aspects of ourselves that are calling to us, it can manifest in all kinds of different ways. And so I just love John the Baptist, that, that was his whole mission. And like, how beautiful to just have such clarity with what you need to do with your life. Most people have no idea, kind of, and just, I don't know. I like the purity of that story, you know?
Right, right. And then so there was like three things we'll hit on today, or at least I grouped them in my mind into three things. So there's John the Baptist. What was the other one that you remember that you wanted to talk about?
Well, how to heal your, like, so I guess taking these stories and translating them in ways that you can begin to use that information to heal yourself, and and go through your trauma, understanding that it's a doorway. It's not a pit, or the pit is the best doorway to go through.
Great.
That
Yeah.
you are, like the story we talked about last time, you have to go sometimes to the depths with yourself and grab your own hand, and transform the relationship that you have within yourself based on your perception of what you've experienced thus far, and how that's manifested in your life,
For
um,
sure.
and sort of showing up. And then I wanted to talk about the devil too, because it's so taboo, and the demons that we fight inside of ourselves. I think it's so, like, what do we call a demon, what do we call the devil, and what don't we? And it's just demonizing one thing, glorifying another thing, and them being the same thing, or one being a lesson and the other being purposely to control people, or to sever and separate themselves. And it's like, I guess this is a really, are the powers that be that is happening right now, are they just following the alignment of the stars of what's being played out and told to us, or are
Well,
they
that's a fourth
trying to
topic, Lindsay.
intercept? Is that a whole
That's
nother conversation?
that's a fourth topic. No, this is a really good conversation, and I like what you just said about I like what you just said about the identity of the devil and these questions about the way that has been used. So actually, I prepared a little presentation, and maybe we can jump into it in a second. But
Yeah.
as I started to do that, I realized this is really brilliant three topics that they seem somewhat unrelated: John the Baptist, the devil, and healing yourself. But actually, I think they all work together really, really well. So I'm really glad that you asked that. And it didn't really all come together in my mind until I put together this little presentation. So hopefully it'll come across, and hopefully it'll help help people, and they'll really enjoy this presentation. But are you ready to dive into it and
Yes,
look at the
totally.
identity of John the Baptist? We'll start with
Yes.
John the Baptist, go to the identity of the devil, and talk about healing and reconciling with ourself and recovering ourself.
Yeah,
Obviously,
that's great.
we won't get to the depths of each of those in the time that we have here, but it's a very deep subject, but they're really connected in some amazing ways. So I think it's going to be fun to look at. So let me start sharing my screen if I can. Start sharing. Let me know when you see my screen.
Oh, I can see myself.
Yeah, probably. Probably.
Okay, I see it.
Okay, whoops, I'm not even supposed to be on that page. What's going on here? Um, oh, because that's my browser. Let me go to here we go. Okay, so here we are on January 17th, and I prepared some slides about John the Baptist. So I thought I'd start just with some text, uh,
Oh,
not the most visual pictures to put up, but we'll get to some pictures later. But who is John the Baptist? And he's found in the different gospel accounts. This is from the gospel according to John. You can see John chapter 1. And let's focus in on verse 23. It says, I'm the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord. So we'll remember that he says that. So he's a voice crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as said the prophet Isaiah, which is a Greek way of saying Isaiah.
hmm.
Uh, then a few verses further down, he says this important thing. He's talking about someone else who's coming after me. John says, he it is who coming after me is preferred before me. He's coming after me, but he's preferred before me, whose shoes latchet I'm not worthy to unloose. I'm not worthy to untie his shoe, or I'm not worthy to unlatch his sandal. Various ways of being translated. This is the King James version or the authorized version, but it's translated in different ways. This is off of the Blue Letter Bible, which you can find online and search through. It's just a convenient way. I could take a photocopy from my Bible, but I'll just take a screenshot from the Blue Letter Bible. And then a few verses later, John is baptizing. It says, at Bethabara beyond Jordan, where John was baptizing in verse 28 there. And then in verse 29, the next day, John seeth Jesus coming unto him and saith, behold the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. A famous line there. And I'll just
Hmm.
show from a few other, you can look in different gospels. You can go to the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke, but I'll just show a few more from Matthew. Some of these are very parallel. Again, John is saying, I'm not the one, I'm not the main one. I'm pointing to someone who's coming after me. I indeed baptize you with water unto repentance, but he that cometh after me is mightier than I, whose shoes I'm not worthy to bear. In this case, he's saying I'm not worthy to carry his shoes as opposed to unlatch them. He shall baptize you with the Holy Ghost and with fire, whose fan is in his hand, and he will thoroughly purge his floor and gather his wheat into the garner, but he will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. So we'll get into that verse. There's a lot here that is celestial. And so we'll see that. This is a painting from the early 1400s. Your microphone, Lindsay, is making like a tapping a little bit. I don't know.
Is it?
Yeah, I don't know. It's been doing that a little bit, and it's not distracting to me, but I
Is
just
that
mentioned.
better?
Yeah, it's like almost like a little tap tap. I don't know what it's doing, but it's okay.
It's
Um,
probably my nervous tick. I'm just like hitting it with
oh
my
yeah,
ring
don't
as hard as possible. I'll
don't,
stop
don't
it.
interrupt. But look at this outline. Look at the Jordan there, or the river, and then you
Hmm.
see the dove descending. That's described in some of the other verses that I didn't outline, but they were on the previous page in the end of the Matthew passage. But let's just focus in on this outline. And John the Baptist is a complex character, but he is definitely associated with who might pour water. If you're a constellation, who might pour water on other people? Who might pour out water, do you think? Out of the zodiac signs, which one might be associated with pouring out water?
Is that I'm not familiar with those zodiacs. Is that like Aquarius
Okay,
or that?
good. Yeah, you shouldn't second guess yourself. You're
Oh,
absolutely right.
all
So
right.
there's the outline of Aquarius, and that's the outline as outlined by H.A. Rey. If you go to the Wikipedia outline, it'll be some horrendous outline that won't look like anything. This is the outline of Aquarius as per H.A. Rey. It's a very distinctive outline. It looks like a person pitched forward, almost running
Mhm.
headlong forward, an eager, leaning forward constellation. And then he's got this water vessel, which is actually the easiest part of the constellation to find, or one of the easiest parts. The head is kind of distinctive too, with that single eye in the middle and kind of a diamond shape. You can spot that in the sky. But Aquarius is actually in a very dark region of the sky without many bright stars at all. So it really is in the wilderness. It's not an easy constellation to spot. It's a faint constellation. There's no very bright stars in Aquarius. The size of the dots on the page show how bright the star is. The brightest star is right below Aquarius. That is the star Fomalhaut, which means in Arabic, or it's derived from an Arabic words meaning the mouth of the fish. That's in the constellation known as the Southern Fish, or Piscis Austrinus, right below. So it's almost like he's pouring out on that fish. But that's the brightest star. You see how much bigger it is? You can see
Yeah.
that Aquarius is very full of faint stars, but Fomalhaut is very bright, the mouth of the fish. And then, just in case people are wondering, what's that goat-looking constellation right behind Aquarius?
I thought it was the bull. Oh, that's
Yeah,
Capricorn.
that's Capricorn, the little goat with his goat horns,
Okay.
pointing towards Aquarius. But can you see how the outline of this painter, Brother Angelico, he was a monk and he was a talented artist, obviously, and he painted beautiful paintings, has depicted John the Baptist almost in the posture of Aquarius?
Yeah, I think, the when you do the paintings and then show the constellations, I think to me that's really mind-blowing. It's amazing.
It's pretty amazing that
It really
these
is amazing. I
conventions
mean,
these conventions
yeah,
just
just the
kept.
interpretation and how clear you can see it.
Yeah. Now, that's not necessarily proof. People say, well, if somebody painted it that way, but we'll go to the text and see. So let me go to, this is a screenshot from the night sky well, it's not the actual night sky. It's from a planetarium app called Stellarium that I like to use. And I've outlined Aquarius again. There he is, or he or she. These constellations can play male figures and female figures in the myth. But in this case, John the Baptist is a male figure. And he's over there sinking towards the west as we are looking towards the south. So as we're looking south, I'm taking a screenshot from the northern hemisphere. You can see down at the bottom the actual latitude and longitude. And um, well, I cut off a little bit the latitude and longitude, but let me not get sidetracked. I'm looking south. So that means if we're looking south, east is actually to our left, because east is to the right when we're looking north. But when we're looking south, east is to the left of our screen, west is to the right. So Aquarius is over in the west there. But in the text itself, it says, John seeth Jesus coming unto him and saith, Behold the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. That's from John 1:29. Now, where is Aquarius looking towards? Let's find out what he's looking at. You can see the head of Aquarius is looking right towards this constellation right here,
Hmm.
which is what constellation might be a lamb.
Oh, I know which one's the sheep. Gosh, is that Capricorn?
Well,
Oh,
so
Aries.
Capricorn's a goat, but sheep and goats are related to one
Sheep
another. They're
and goats.
both
Okay.
actually caprids. So the word caprid applies to the family of sheep and goats, but Aries is the ram or the lamb. There are actually stars that make little horns over the head of Aries. They're very faint. I didn't draw them in, but Aries is the ram.
Hmm.
Also, could be a lamb if you don't draw in the horns. He's looking right towards the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. And actually, there's an interpreter from the early 1800s, whom we'll talk about a little bit later, Robert Taylor. Like I mentioned with Hamlet's Mill, I'm not the first to explore these connections. Robert Taylor was a reverend. We'll talk about him in a little bit, but he says, why does Aries take away the sin of the world, the unevenness of the world. He argues, and he argues that this line, "Behold the Lamb of God," refers to John the Baptist seeing the constellation Aries. So I give him credit for that. And he says Aries is the month of the spring equinox, at least during the age of Aries. So at the equinox, day and night are even. We've taken away the reign of darkness because at the spring equinox, we've just gone through the nights being longer than days all winter, and now we're moving up towards spring, and then at the equinox, days and nights are equal. So Robert Taylor argues that this line, "who taketh away the sin of the world," has to do with taking away the unevenness of the days and bringing everything into balance and equilibrium, which is a nice interpretation. So let's continue with some more texts. There's also that line that I pointed out, "He that cometh after me is mightier than I, whose fan is in his hand, and he will thoroughly, that's just an older way of saying thoroughly, purge his floor." What are we talking about? "And gather his wheat into the garner." Okay, purging his floor, he has a fan, has something to do with wheat. That's from the passage in Matthew 3 that we looked at. What constellation coming after Aquarius is mightier than Aquarius? I've outlined it here. That is,
I don't know. Is that Virgo? Isn't Virgo the I'm really bad with
that's
constellations.
okay. No, that's all right.
I have no idea.
This is one with a famous belt of 3 stars. You can see the famous belt of 3 stars. Can you see those 3 stars at the belt? It's the belt of
the belt of Orion. Yeah.
Orion,
Okay.
a very, very powerful looking constellation. In fact, Orion has many bright
I was thinking of a
stars.
zodiac sign.
Yeah. Well, that's good guess. In this case, is not talking about a zodiac sign, although Orion is very close to both Taurus and Gemini. But Orion has more bright stars per total stars than any other constellation. It is usually, if people know one constellation, it's usually Orion. Sometimes it's the Big Dipper plus Orion, but usually people can find the 3 belt stars. But look at how many bright stars. There's Betelgeuse in the upper shoulder on the left of our screen. There's Rigel in the foot. And notice that Orion holding a fan. Now, he's coming after Aquarius because the sky appears to rotate from east to west, or everything rises in the east and sets in the west. So like I said, we're facing south. Everything on the left is the east. That is rising. So Orion is rising up on the left or east side as Aquarius is sinking down. So he that cometh after me, that's Orion, is coming after Aquarius, much mightier. On the screen, it looks like Aquarius is bigger than Orion, and Aquarius is a big constellation. But Stellarium kind of makes things look larger as they get to the edges. So,
well, and if you had to pick a visual of which one's mightier, would you pick the one that looks like it has a bow and a sword, or the one that's like kneeling with their head kind of bowed?
Right. And Orion is a huge constellation. I'm just saying it looks bigger in the sky than it does here because of the way what Stellarium does is it gives you this wraparound effect. So things in the center of the screen are smaller. So as Orion moves towards the center, he's getting smaller, but he's really a huge constellation, he or she. But anyway, so he that cometh after me is mightier than I, whose fan is in his hand. This is terminology that has to do with a certain activity, purging his floor, his threshing floor, and gathering his wheat into the garner. What kind of a fan do you think that they're talking about here? Any guesses? Is a hard question.
What, the sickle or something that like?
Well, it could be it does look like a sickle for sure, chopping down the wheat. But in this case, there's a very specific implement that is being used. And here's an actual picture of a woman in northern part of India, still using this method of threshing out the wheat to this day, or in modern times. It's called a winnowing fan in English. In English, we call it a winnowing fan. They're actually tossing the grain into the wind to separate out the wheat from the chaff. That's what's happening. She's
Yeah.
tossing she's winding it, she's winnowing it, she's throwing it to the wind. Look at how clearly that fan resembles what Orion is carrying. I
Yeah.
mean, usually Orion's thought of as carrying a bow or a club, but in this case, being described as a fan, specifically in the text, this is a reference to Orion, and that club is being envisioned as a winnowing fan instead of as a club, and I'll show you more evidence to support that in a moment. But it's almost like she's in the outline of Orion. Look at her, she's standing there in northern India.
Mm-hmm.
There's a picture from Wikipedia. You can find it on Wikipedia, from the region of Uttar Pradesh. I'm probably mispronouncing it slightly wrong, but anyway, that is the winnowing fan that this text is talking about in the Bible. It's telling you which constellation is the mightier that's coming after John the Baptist. Now, he also says, I'm the voice crying in the wilderness. He's in the wilderness of faint stars. He's in a very dim region. In fact, H.A. Ray in his book says this is what some people call the wet region. It's like a vast ocean where there's not many stars. Aquarius is crying in the wilderness, excuse me, make straight the way of the Lord. And that's in John 1:23. And right in front of Orion, a way is an old word for a road. Make straight the path of the Lord, or the road of the Lord. There's this long constellation in front of Orion. It looks like it needs to be straightened out a little bit. That is actually called, that constellation is actually called to this day the River Eridanus. The River Eridanus, which is, as you can maybe tell by even the pronunciation, it's like the River Jordan, Eridanus, the River Jordan, the River Jordan. Anyway, that's where he's going to baptize Jesus in the River Jordan. It says it right in the text. So I would argue this is about, straightening out the path for this one that will come after. It's not talking about literal persons. It's talking about a scene in the heavens. It has to do with the heavenly cycles, and ultimately is going to have to do with recovering our connection with our self, our true self, our higher self, our essential self. And there's one other verse, I didn't put it up on the screen earlier, but it's a very important verse, and it's quoted a lot in churches. In
Must increase, but I must decrease.
this is something that John the Baptist actually says of the one who comes after him, of Jesus. He says, look, don't focus on me, focus on him. He must increase, but I must decrease. I put it in italics. That means the word is not actually in the original text. That's added in the English translation. So it actually says, he must increase, but I decrease. Well, Orion is rising. This is celestial language on one level. Orion is rising towards the center of the sky. That constellation is going to reach its highest point when it gets right above the southern declination, right when it reaches the apex of the sky, whereas Aquarius is sinking down into the west. But this is what happens with constellations all the time. They rise in the east, they set in the west. But John the Baptist is saying, he's increasing, I'm decreasing. That's celestial, but it's also metaphorical. And that recovering yourself, the more you get in touch with who you really are, yourself, the more you're going to heal those problems. Or the self is the one who's actually going to heal those splits and put things into order. So we'll get into that in a little bit later. But this is not just celestial pointing to the heavens, which it obviously is. It's also celestial pointing to something that is about us, that's going on inside us, that we can benefit from. So I also wanted to point this out. So this is not from the Bible. This is obviously an ancient Greek piece of artwork. It's on an ancient Greek vase or double-handled amphora or double-handled cup. I think it's a crater. They have different specific names for each type of vessel. I forget which one this one is or don't know. But this is actually a painting from the Odyssey, one of my favorite works, like I mentioned. This is actually a very important part of the Odyssey. It's almost the it's almost the point around which everything pivots in the Odyssey. It's when Odysseus goes down to the underworld, and that's Odysseus right there. He goes to the realm of Circe. He finds himself on the island of Circe, and she's this very dangerous, powerful goddess who can turn men into beasts. She turns most of his crew into pigs. Um, and but Odysseus, on his way to Circe, is met by the god Hermes, who says, "Hold on, Odysseus, you're wandering towards Circe's palace. You're about to get turned into an animal if you don't listen to me. She's a goddess, but I can help you. You need to take this special herb, and then her magic won't work on you, and then you'll be okay." And so he goes to Circe, and then her magic doesn't work on him. And then she says, "Well, you must be a god, or else you're being helped by the gods." And they eventually become lovers. And Odysseus stays with Circe for, quite. He has all these different encounters, and
what was the herb? Maybe whatever he took made
it's
him
called,
fall in love with her.
yeah, maybe it was a trick.
Yeah, totally. It's a
Hermes
double trick.
It's called moly in the text. They call it moly.
Moly?
Moly, Moly.
Like
Anyway,
Molly? I wonder if that's where
yeah,
Molly came from.
maybe so. But anyway, I'm getting a little off track, but this is the backstory to how he ends up in the underworld. Circe,
Okay.
finally, the gods come to Odysseus and say, "Hey, you're supposed to be trying to get home, not just stay with Circe." And he says, "Oh, yeah." And she says, "Okay, well, if you're really going to leave, here's what you need to do. You need to go down to the underworld and take this trip down into the underworld, which is found in virtually every myth system, has a voyage to the underworld. It's very important. And it represents, like you said, going down into the darkness, into ourselves, right? To find those buried things that we need to efface and address." And so she says, you have to go down and you need to find the great seer, the great wise Tiresias. He was the wisest man who ever lived. And he is a prophet, and he can tell you, the reason you can't get home is because Poseidon is angry at you, the god of the sea, Neptune, to the Romans, or Poseidon to the Greeks. Odysseus has angered Poseidon, and so Tiresias can tell you how you can get home. But the only way, since Tiresias is dead, you're going to have to go to the underworld to ask him. So Odysseus goes to the underworld, and he follows the instructions of Circe very carefully. She says, "Listen, if you mess up, you're not going to come back from the underworld. So do it just the way I tell you. Slay a ram." And you can see he's got his knife out there. He's made this offering. He pours the blood into a trench, and then the spirits, the ghosts, come to drink the blood, which is very, interesting why they drink blood in the underworld. But anyway, he summons forth the different ghosts. Yeah, and the only one he lets to drink first is Tiresias. And you can see the ancient artist has portrayed Tiresias as a disembodied head that is coming up to drink the blood and to tell Odysseus his message. He's going to answer whatever questions Odysseus has for him. So that's Tiresias down there, that disembodied head. Can you see it? How it looks like a head?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah. His foot's like almost touching his nose.
Right, that's right. This is all celestial. I talk about this in one of my books, Star Myths of the World, Volume 2, which is all about Greek mythology. But this is one of Odysseus brought two companions with him there. One of his companions, Eurylochus, has his legs crossed. You see how he has his legs crossed? And he's wearing a certain type of headgear, which is called a Phrygian cap. Those are celestial clues to which constellation Eurylochus is in this. But not to get sidetracked, what does Tiresias tell Odysseus? This is really important, and it connects to John the Baptist. Here's a copy of an old translation from the 1800s of the Odyssey. It's a literal translation, like a word-for-word translation, which I like. And it was in the 1800s, so they used some of the Roman names for the gods, like Neptune instead of Poseidon, and they use Ulysses instead of Odysseus, which I prefer Odysseus and Poseidon. But anyway, this is from chapter 11. He's down in the underworld, and this is Tiresias. This is this giant quote that I've got on the left side of the page that I'm starting to underline. This is Tiresias speaking. He says, "When you get back home and you slay the suitors in your palace," these are all the suitors who are pursuing Odysseus' wife. They all want to marry his wife because he's been gone for 10 years. They think he's dead. and he was the king, so they want to marry his wife and take over all his, his palace and everything. Well, when
Hmm.
you slay the suitors in the palace, either by deceit or openly with sharp brass, then go, taking a well-fitted oar, until thou comest to those men who are not acquainted with the sea. So you're going to take an oar on your shoulder and walk inland until you get so far that you come to a race of people or a group of people who've never, they're not even familiar with the sea. They don't eat food mixed with salt. They're not acquainted with crimson-cheeked ships, nor well-fitted oars, which are also wings to ships. And when another traveler, as you're walking along the road, shall, come alongside you and say, "Hey, why do you have a winnowing fan on your shoulder?" Then you know you've gone far enough, because they don't even know what an oar is. They think it's a winnowing fan. So you'll be carrying an oar, and you'll get so far in that you come to a country where they don't even know about the sea, and they'll see this oar on your shoulder, and they'll go, "Hello, stranger. Why are you walking down the road with a winnowing fan on your shoulder?" Then I want you to fix thy well-fitted oar in the earth. In other words, build a big mound and put the oar standing up in the mound
Hmm.
like an offering. And having offered beautiful sacrifices to King Neptune, Poseidon, the god who's preventing you from getting home, a ram, a bull, and a boar, the mate of swine, then return home and offer up sacred hecatombs to all the immortal gods who possess the wide heaven, to all of them in order. And then after that, death will come on you at some point in your old age. A gentle death will come to you. So this is Tiresias telling Odysseus, here's how you're going to die, but here's how you get, eventually, here's how you're going to die, but here's how you're going to get over the enmity with Poseidon that you have. You're going to take a winnowing fan is like central to this whole story of the Odyssey, and it's the same. It's a it's like, what's that doing in the Bible if it's in the Odyssey, which was written at least 700 years before the New Testament era was supposed to have taken place, because it's all based on this ancient system, and that is a celestial. This is all talking about celestial cycles, but it's talking about recovering from these divisions. You're divided against part of heaven, or part of heaven is divided against you. Here's how we're going to overcome that. Here's how you're going to overcome that. So,
And so I'm curious, this division, I mean, is this something that, the stars say that we created? Is that just part of being on this realm and this planet, is that we're going to have that division regardless? Or like, because through the myths, a lot of them are like the division comes from like desire, right? Or manipulation, or mostly desire in a lot of ways, and so, and when you're talking about an absolute and like things that actually happened, I think that kind of indoctrinates that like desire is bad. But desire is a gateway to deeper learning within yourself, and it's just the amount that I guess organized teachings have made us feel bad about desire has not lessened it in any way. If anything, it's like corrupted it and perverted it and made it go so out of control that um, it's chaos within ourselves.
right. No, this is a great question, great observations, and a great segue into discussing
The
the
devil.
devil and the healing.
Yeah.
So I totally agree with what you said. So it does have to do with these. Um, well, let me go back to sharing and show you my next slides, and we'll get into it, because this question of who is the devil that you asked about, I want to start off with some passages. Again, apologies for throwing a bunch of text onto your screen, but this is from a wonderful book
I have to
by,
read.
yeah, Alvin Boyd Kuhn, Lost Light, published in 1940. And I refer to Alvin Boyd Kuhn a lot in my blogs and in my videos and my books. And
Okay.
this book is just really, really wonderful resource. You can see I'm showing pages 336 and 337. It's like many hundred page book. I think it's 400 something pages. But actually, in my website, there is if you go down to the bottom of any screen, there's a link that says resources, and you can click resources and get to that text of the Odyssey that I just showed online.
Mm-hmm.
You can read the whole thing online. You can read Lost Light online. I've got under resources, I've got links to these where you can read them online. So
Oh,
this,
that's awesome.
yeah,
Okay.
this is, and this is a great one to read. I mean, you can obviously buy the text version and enjoy reading it in a nice, comfortable chair, or you can read it online and it's searchable. So here he is, Alvin Boyd Kuhn, talking about the devil, the adversary. The word devil means one who stands against, diabolos, standing against you, standing opposite, the diametrically opposed one, the opposite one, the opposer. So he says that, so he's saying the role of this opposer, this adversary, yeah, it's even got the Greek word for die or to. This role has all too easily become misunderstood for one of absolute evil. There's nothing in the Bible that actually says, the devil is absolute evil incarnate all the time. He's the adversary, the opposer, the.
Duality, really, right?
That's
Of
right.
yeah.
Well, this is what Alvin Boyd Kuhn is arguing. I'm not saying I agree with, I'm offering this up for everybody to consider. Here's Alvin
Mm-hmm.
Boyd Kuhn's take on it. It's all too easily become misunderstood as being something that's absolute evil that just delights in evil, but it should really be envisaged as relative, it's opposite, as conducive. I clicked ahead. Don't look over to the right yet. Let's go back to inside this square. Sorry. All too
Okay.
easily. I should have underlined a few more lines, because if you go beyond that part that I underlined where it says misunderstood for absolute evil, should have
Mm-hmm.
been envisaged as being relative, conducive to the awakening of the positive energies of life itself. Kind of what you were saying. There's actually, it's like lifting weights. You've got to have resistance in order to, or if
Yeah,
you're
or
on an
nothing's
exercise
happening. You're
bike,
just
if you're on an
yeah.
exercise bike with no resistance, you're kind of wasting your time. So um, he he then over on the right, I've put a little bracket there to pick out another sentence where Alvin Boyd Kuhn says the transmogrification of this dramatic personage into some kind of a bogeyman to harass millions of children by Christendom is
Yeah.
perhaps the crowning disservice which a distorted theology has rendered its unenlightened devotees. So he's being a little bit critical, a lot critical of Christianity, turning something that's an illustration into something that is literal, absolute evil. He's saying that's a total misunderstanding, and it is doing a disservice. It's taking something that's drama, something that's metaphor and allegory, and turning it into. But let me just show one more page of his, and we'll get into what the celestial, because there's celestial aspects to this too. But it's a lot of what you were just saying. This is
I should
a
write a
great.
book
Yeah,
on
you should. You should be writing books. You absolutely should. I totally endorse that. So here he's referring on the very next page, 338, Plotinus, who's a Neoplatonic ancient philosopher, great to read. Plotinus declares that if the soul keeps her eye fixed steadily on the star of her higher self, well, that's interesting, then,
Yeah.
quote, here's Plotinus in a direct quote, she need not regret having become acquainted with evil or knowing the nature of vice, and having had the opportunity of manifesting her creative faculties through her conjunction with the body. Now, before someone accuses me of endorsing evil, which I don't, this is not what he's talking about of evil or sin. In the paragraph earlier, he says sin is spirit mixing with matter and becoming mixed in with the proclivities of the flesh, or our physical form is like something we're wrestling with. Now you can go overboard and give into that to an inordinate or disproportionate degree, and then it becomes sin or evil, or is not good for you. But Plotinus says if you gave into that, or if you experienced that, it's not, if you're fixed on your higher self, it will become like positive, potentially positive for you. It will point you towards recovery of the self. Anyway,
I
I
resonate with that wholeheartedly on like multiple levels. I think that that is true for me, and might not be true for others, but I even think the word evil has been so overused. The devil's been so overused as a way to fear looking within ourselves. And that's why people are really, that's what they're afraid of, is the boogeyman that lives inside of them, and that they feel they can't go to these depths because they can't handle it. But when we're connected with our high selves, you realize that you are able to see all these aspects of yourself, of what is all of it, because it's a part of the whole. And I think it's interesting. Like, I never thought that, because I'm the monad, the dyad, and the triad, right? The Vesica Pisca is the dyad, is like the shadow self, which is like the devil.
that's a really interesting
So
connection. It's a
awesome. I
great
love
connection.
it.
Yeah. And so, I don't talk about this, I mean, you asked me to talk about it, but it's easy to be misunderstood. I am not advocating harming others. I'm not
Oh,
advocating
yeah. Yes. No
because
way.
this has been twisted in all kinds of ways. The Bhagavad Gita says, do what's right without worrying about the outcome. I'm not saying do what's wrong and don't worry about it, but this is really powerful and it's important. And I'll show you some celestial connections too. Alvin Boyd Kuhn is great.
I'm going
He
to read
doesn't,
this.
yeah, it's all online. You can get to it right through my website if you want.
Cool.
And over here on the right, he has another, well, I'll just highlight one of his other sentences. This whole thing has been turned into a misunderstanding. He says it's incomprehension of turning charming and luminously suggestive typology. Type is a kind of a word for a metaphor,
Hmm.
typically a biblical metaphor. But anyway, charming and luminous typology. It's all very, enlightening typology, but turning it into crass realism, or turning into, oh, there's a literal devil. And I'm not saying that there's not things both inside of us and on a spiritual plane that are dangerous, powerful, and in some cases malevolent. That
Yeah.
they're inside of us, they're outside of us, and they're in the world around us. I'm not denying any of those things, but I'm saying this is Alvin Boyd Kuhn's take on the devil. And he's saying if you actually read the text of the Bible, there nowhere does it say the devil is evil incarnate, all evil all the time. There's actually, it's all celestial anyway, which I'm going to show you in a moment. So this is a diagram of the zodiac wheel. I've shown it on lots of my videos and other interviews. And most people are, at least familiar with some of the zodiac. If I said the names of the different zodiac signs, we all know pretty much what our birth sign is, where the sun was.
Right. Yeah.
So those are this one uses pictures, so I put the labels there. But as we go through the cycles of the year, the upper half of the year is on the top. I like this particular diagram. It's from the early 1600s because basically the upper half of the year, that's where days are longer. That we're going around, in this case, in a clockwise fashion. You could arrange it where you go around in a counterclockwise fashion. It's just a diagram to try and show what's happening in the sky. It's a convenient way to show on paper. So
Hmm.
in this case, we're going clockwise. Some of them arrange them counterclockwise, doesn't matter. But the upper half is where days are longer than nights
Hmm.
in the northern hemisphere, and the lower half is where days are shorter than nights. And the very top is the summer solstice at the longest point. That's in between Gemini and Cancer in the age of Aries here. I'm not going to go into the precession right now, and at the bottom is the shortest day at the winter solstice.
Hmm.
Or the December solstice. It's the winter for the northern hemisphere. But these
Which is right
cycles,
around Jesus's birthday.
that's right. So
Also
we
very
celebrate,
interesting.
yeah, we celebrate the rebirth of the higher self, or the birth of the divine self happens at the lowest part of the year when the sun starts to turn back upwards in
Yeah,
the
so it's
northern
like 3
hemisphere.
days after
The
winter
solstice.
solstice. Yeah.
Exactly right. Exactly
Yeah.
right. So how does this have to do with the concept of the devil? Well, let me introduce another even earlier than Alvin Boyd Kuhn. Alvin Boyd Kuhn lived from 1885 to 1963. So he was early 20th century, mostly 1885 to 1963. But this is the Reverend Robert Taylor, who I mentioned earlier. he was actually a reverend. He was a preacher, and then he got kicked out. He got kicked out of his church once he started realizing that the stories in the Bible are based on the stars. And then he started preaching about that. And he even got locked in jail. Yeah, he even got locked up for 3 years total, not 3 years in a row.
Kooky.
He lived from 1784 to 1844, as I put down at the bottom of your screen. But you can get to this on my resources page as well and read his entire book. It was published after his death. You can see it was published in 1857. These are his sermons. His sermons were collected and published later. And this one is called The Devil's Pulpit. And so some of what I'm going to tell you comes out of this book, The Devil's Pulpit, or Astrotheological Sermons, which is, even today, we talk about astrotheology. I'm pretty sure this is the first place that was used. And so you can search it because it's online. You can search for the word devil and read about some of what he says. And also, there's another collection of his sermons called Astronomico-Theological Lectures, and I link to that too. Both of them published by the same publisher in 1857. So some of what I'm telling you here comes from these two sources. But he argues, and I think he's absolutely right about this, when we're talking about the devil, diabolos, the opponent, the accuser, the name Satan also means, or is said to mean, the accuser. He argues that it also means the wise one, the wisest, the seat of wisdom, which, remember, in the Garden of Eden, who comes to, give them the tree of the knowledge of good and evil?
The serpent.
That's right. The serpent is a sign of wisdom.
Can I just ask one thing really quick?
Of course you can.
Okay. Well, and then Satan, Saturn, the devil, is that all interlinked as well? Or
yeah,
are
some
those...
people say that.
And then there's also Venus, because Venus is the brightest star and Lucifer was the brightest
star. Yeah.
Star.
And I've been asked that a lot, and I go into that in some of my blog posts.
Okay, well, I'll look through those. You don't have to do a whole thing on it. But
the bright morning star, I saw Satan fall like a star from the heavens.
And because it comes before the sun.
And that's Lucifer. Lucifer is the bright, the light bringer. Lucifer comes from the word lux, which is Latin for light. So Lucifer means the light bringer. So if you read Robert Taylor, and you can find, he goes so far as to say there's no difference between Jesus and the devil and God and the devil. They're all the same. I don't go that far to say that because it can be easily misunderstood. But what he's saying is it's two aspects of the same thing, but opposing each other in a certain way, which now I'll go back to sharing my screen and show you what the
light and the dark.
Yeah. So back to my sharing. Am I sharing my screen again? Yeah. So
yeah, I see me.
Great. So back to this. The reason I introduced the zodiac wheel is Aries, for instance, has a sign that is opposite to it. The opposite sign. You see?
Yeah.
So opposite Aries in the dome of heaven, or in the sphere of stars around us. It's not really a sphere, but it appears to be a sphere around us. I don't believe in a flat earth. I just have to say that. But opposite, there is an opposing sign. And as we move around the circle, there's always an opposite.
Right.
Opposite to Taurus is Scorpio. So Taurus, remember how I said that Orion is right next to Taurus and Gemini? Yeah. So in the winter, we see Orion in the winter for the northern hemisphere right now. You can see Orion glorious in the middle of the sky. In the summer, or 6 months from now, where you see Orion now, you'll see Scorpio, and it's a big, glorious constellation as well. So right now you see Orion and Taurus and Gemini are prime time stargazing hours. You can go out tonight and see the glorious Orion and Taurus and Gemini, and you can see Aries. The planet Mars is right next to Aries right now. But 6 months from now, the opposite, the opposing set of stars will be in the same place. So as we move around, one goes up, one goes down. You see, it's the opposer.
Yeah.
So Robert Taylor talks about actually right after John the Baptist. So it's really interesting that you said, let's talk about John the Baptist and the identity of the devil. Right after in the Bible, there's the John the Baptist passage where Jesus is baptized by John. That's the start of his official ministry. People who take it literally say that's when, you know, at the age of 30 or 33, 30, he started his earthly ministry at that baptism. That was his. And then the dove came down, and then everyone knew the Holy Spirit came down in the form of a dove, and that's when he started his earthly ministry. And right after that, he was taken into the wilderness. He goes into the wilderness and fasts for 40 days, and he encounters the devil. That's
Hmm.
the temptation of Christ comes right after. It says, and then he went into the wilderness and was tempted and fasted and was tempted by the devil, and he was brought up into the highest mountain, or the highest point in the devil's, or the highest point on the temple. And the devil says, throw yourself down from the temple. And the Bible verses say that your Father will protect you. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. Get behind me. Get opposite to me. So as one gets dragged up, one goes down. It's the same but opposite. Robert Taylor explains that this is all celestial, but it is metaphorical. It doesn't mean it's not true. It doesn't
Right.
mean there's not an adversary. It doesn't mean that you don't have powerful forces inside you that you need to wrestle with. And that doesn't
Yeah,
mean
or there's
it's
not
not.
external powers that, as
Absolutely.
well that we're connected with.
Absolutely. So I think it's an adversary, but it's an adversary that is, um, it's actually, all the language in the Bible is actually celestial, and it's actually talking about us. It's telling us things that have to do with our recovery of this split. So, and it's also, and the devil, the figure of the devil can be shown to be celestial. I'll show you one more um, passage from Revelation. This is a painting of the archangel Michael
Hmm.
defeating the devil. You can see down under his feet, he's actually standing on a diabolical figure, the devil. This is from the war in heaven scene that's described in the book of Revelation. This is the book of Revelation from the Blue Letter Bible again. It talks about, this is Revelation 12, very famous passage where it says there's a woman clothed with the sun with the moon under her feet. Very celestial language. But there appeared another wonder in heaven. It's describing constellations in the heavens. A great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven and did cast them to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. So we can positively identify at least one constellation that the dragon, who later is identified as the devil and Satan down in verse 9, you'll see that in a moment, with a specific constellation, the one that's in front of the woman who's about to give birth, ready to devour her child. So there's the woman
Which
who's
is a
about to give.
terrifying story, by the way, to hear when you're a
Terrifying.
child, if you grew up in religion, which
Right.
I did.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, so you can see Virgo
Yeah, look at
there.
that.
She looked like she's on her back, with her legs
Yeah.
elevated. If you've ever been in the presence of someone giving birth or giving birth yourself, then you know that you have to put your
And
feet
hold
up on
on.
those things, right? And push. And so, who is right in front of her, ready to devour her child as soon as she gives birth, but the 7-headed or multi-headed Scorpio, constellation
Yeah,
Scorpio,
and that also looks like the serpent, right? The Scorpio and the
right?
serpent are sort of one and the same in stories. Is that not true, or is that
So
true?
Scorpio plays a serpent quite a lot. It does play a
Okay.
scorpion, sometimes plays a scorpion in myth, but much more often plays a serpent, sometimes a serpent with many heads. In the myths of ancient India, in the Greek myths where Hercules or Heracles fights the 9-headed Hydra.
Hmm.
Uh, so this is a dragon with 7 heads who later is described. Oh, by the way, these little sections where it says the red dragon, Satan, the male child card, those are put in later by the Blue Letter Bible people. You can see they've even put a little copyright. So that means it's a new invention. They made a
Gotcha.
copy. Those, I would disregard those completely.
Okay.
Uh, so down later on, Revelation 12:7, there was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. Same dragon. The dragon fought and his angels, and the dragon and his angels prevailed not. See, it says the dragon fought and his angels and prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in heaven. They got cast down out of heaven, just as the stars are always sinking down into the western horizon. And the one who is casting them out, I'll just give you an arrow there. That's Ophiuchus. You see how he's standing right on top of Scorpio?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we'll look at the painting in a second, but that great dragon was cast out. The great dragon was cast out. That old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. So it's celestial. And you can read Robert Taylor and read more about who he thinks the devil is and read more Alvin Boyd Kuhn on your own. But I'm just showing there is no doubt in my mind that this is celestial. And you can see even in the 1400s when someone's painting, you can look at all kinds of paintings of Michael and the dragon. And almost always Michael is standing above the dragon, just as Ophiuchus stands directly above Scorpio. Mm-hmm. And Ophiuchus, the usual weapon that an Ophiuchus figure will carry is a spear. Sometimes you'll see Michael with a sword, but usually it's a spear. And you can see why. Ophiuchus looks like he's carrying at least one spear, sometimes two spears. And in this case, the artist has really outlined it very clearly to see that Michael is associated with Ophiuchus. But just in case anyone's still doubting, and I've shown this before, but I think it's really powerful illustration, what's he carrying in his other hand? Can you see that?
It looks like it's the scales. I was wondering what those were. That's awesome.
Scales. And the devil is pulling down one. Sometimes you'll actually see like an angel pushing, back. So it's like the devil is pulling down the scales. He wants the scales to go down. He wants to bring you down. Right. And the other side's going up. But right next to Ophiuchus is the scales, Libra, the balances. Right. Yeah. So it's very clear that Michael is associated with Ophiuchus, the angel. There's other parts of Revelation where the angel is associated with Ophiuchus. And in this case, the devil or the old serpent or the dragon with 7 heads is associated with Scorpio. So that
is awesome. That, and another thing I wanted to mention, like what I guess what came to mind when you were showing even the zodiac, the circle that, shows the opposites and the duality and one kind of without the other or across the way. Like to me, when you were saying that, was it Robert? I don't remember what's his last name. Robert Taylor says it's all like God, Jesus, the devil. And I'm not trying to offend anybody, is all one and the same, but that really goes along with the wholeness, right? If everything is one and you're going back to the one, the whole, which is the circle that holds all of the 12 zodiac signs and holds all of the separation and the division within the one, like that really makes a lot of sense to me in a metaphysical way or in a spiritual way and maybe even in an actuality way. I don't really know. Who knows what reality is anymore? But it resonates with me really deeply, especially that visual of seeing that all interconnected within this circle, which is the whole self. We're all aspects. Even the 12 zodiacs, we're all aspects. We all have Scorpion qualities or Capricorn or Pisces within us.
And that's right. And I think something you said just now and also at the very beginning, those parts of us or those aspects of us that they actually have something very good to offer, or they have a very positive potential role, even if they're playing a negative role. Right. And a lot of times the negative role they're playing is because they're trying to protect us in some way.
Yes.
But in an inappropriate way. And so, this gets into the third part of your question. You wanted to talk about John the Baptist, the identity of the devil, and how we heal, how we reconcile. That, the third part, what you're saying about it's all inside of us, and the seemingly negative parts have a potential positive role to play, or they can be unburdened from what they're doing. And the terminology that I'm using is from that book that I just showed at the very end on the screen, which we'll dive into in a second. A psychologist named Dr. Richard Schwartz, who has talked about this internal family systems, talking about like we all have a family inside of us, or
Yeah.
it's like a whole, and actually all the gods in ancient myth are a family. If you look at
Yeah.
the Olympian gods, Zeus and Hera have, you know, Mars is their son, or Athena springs out of Zeus's head, or they're all related, but they're like this giant bickering family who are always polarizing into two camps. Polarization. I think the main point that I would take out of the devil part that I just showed with the two sides is polarization.
Mm-hmm.
There is polarization, and polarization has to do with the adversary. And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." He says, go to the other side of me, polarize, separate. But that polarization can be fixed, when parts of us are polarized against each other, and we're like, why did I do that? Or I hate myself. That is a polarization, and the way to overcome it is talked about in the ancient myths. I'm convinced it's described or depicted for us in the ancient myths. So um, let me show some. I'm almost at the end of my slides, but let me go into what I've prepared for your third question of the healing
Okay.
part. Because I think, unless you wanted to react to what I just said more, I think
No,
what you
I mean,
said, I
I just
totally
think
agree
it's
with.
really, I think what you're saying is really powerful. And I think we're just saying the same thing um, is that, yeah, these are all parts of ourselves. I really like that about the mythology. I just saw like the chaos and the fragmentation. That's us. And,
That's right.
but they're always on, it's like at the end of the story, even though they trick themselves or trick each other, there is aspects of them being a family unit and on each other's side in some way and making deals or and we do that with ourselves all the time, constantly, but we're just unaware that that's us doing it to ourselves. I think because it's so easy, and we've been kind of entrained to play the victim or be the victim, whether it's the devil or the ego or our trauma or, the government or, the medical industry or the educational system. It's like these are all opportunities for us to, I guess, I mean, for lack of a better word, like awaken and see our own true selves, right?
Well, yeah, and I wouldn't, and I agree with all those things that you're saying, and I'm not saying that there's not trauma, and I know you're not.
Oh, there
It
is
doesn't,
trauma
and
for
and we
sure.
could create a society that is less trauma inducing or more trauma inducing, and we happen to have a society that I think is more and more trauma inducing, every year, and
Yeah.
in some cases deliberately that way. But so how do we overcome that, or within ourselves? Is what we'll talk about in a second. But for sure, there are things about society that we could address, as if we get together and say, hey, let's make schools less traumatic for children. Let's make the economic environment less trauma inducing for families that are trying to raise children. Let's see what we can do to make a society that is. There have been societies that are less trauma inducing, and there have been societies that are more trauma inducing. So yeah, I totally agree with you that it's outside of us as well as it's inside of us. And it's not like just fixing it inside of us. I'm not saying just fixing it inside of us takes care of the trauma
No, but it
outside.
does help you navigate the world and be
That's
able to
right.
show up and be present with it, and even to do something about it, because it's got to start from within.
That's right. That's right. And that's a really important point too. Is like so I was in the army, as I mentioned at the beginning, and I thought, oh, you got to toughen up kids, they got to be ready for. Well, that's actually the wrong, now in retrospect, I look back and say that was the wrong attitude. If a child is traumatized, they'll be less able to handle they're going into a world that has all kinds of threatening things in it, but they'll be much better able to handle it if you help them grow up to be whole and integrated and not separated from themselves. So some people may say, oh, you know, you got to toughen up kids and blah, blah, blah. And I really think that you've got to protect them from trauma when they're little in order so that when they're older and they do get exposed to all that stuff, they know who they are and
Yeah, I
and
agree with that wholeheartedly. They have a foundation, and I think there's a difference between structure and compassion versus like toughen up and just,
right.
we're gonna muscle our way through raising somebody or teaching somebody a lesson. That might make it easier for you to put it to a compartment that you can handle, but that doesn't necessarily fix or address something very fragmented inside somebody, you
That's
know.
right. That's
And
right.
I think
So
that's what the world does. Certainly our society that we live in, that's a lot of systems are kind of built on that. It's like, I need you to comply so I don't have to think about you anymore and I can move on with whatever it is I got going on that's creating all this discourse and trauma. And I just need you to sort of like check out and ignore that so I can continue on with this mission in a lot of ways. And I agree with you. I think it's purposeful. And I think now addressing our own trauma and healing our own trauma helps us, I guess, be a lot more present and a lot more clear of what's what. Not everything's
absolutely.
a threat. Not everything's traumatizing. You can experience trauma without being traumatized, you know?
Well, and polarization, I think, is a really useful word to keep in mind. We'll just hold on to that from our discussion of the devil, the polarization. And
Yeah.
so when people are polarized, then they're not listening to each other anymore. They're, you know,
They're
they're
at odds. Yeah.
they're at odds. They're like two ends of, the North Pole and the South Pole of a magnet or whatever.
Jesus and the devil.
They're polarized, right?
Yeah.
So how do we um, overcome polarization is getting into self polarization is because we're separated from self. So how do we heal that? So first off, I'll say how you heal that is you go see an actual psychologist, which I am not. So I'll just say that right now. I'm
Yeah.
not I'm not a psychologist. I'm going to refer to Dick Schwartz and his system. There are of IFS. There are other healers who talk about trauma. Dr. Peter Levine, Dr. Gabor Mate, Dr. Richard Schwartz. I would go see a psychologist, but the myths are a tremendous resource. I would argue that the myths are showing you in dramatic pictures the same things that these healers will help you to dive into in yourself. So let me show you a few quotations from Richard Schwartz's book. So I'll go back to sharing now. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so this book, I'm going to take a quotation from Dr. Richard Schwartz and Martha Sweezy's book, Internal Family Systems Therapy, second edition. Like I said, I am not a psychologist. Go see an IFS psychologist if this resonates with you. But
Hmm.
this is really powerful words. And so I'm going to show some text on the screen, and you may say, oh, text again, or viewers may say, oh, text again, but this is really powerful. This is from pages 101 and 102 from that book that I just showed. If a part, he's talking about parts, they're talking about parts, aspects of who we are. So we
Hmm.
all have these aspects, and they're actually parts of our personality that are unique to us. We all have a set that's unique to us, and they're wonderful, but they get pressed into doing jobs, especially if there's been trauma. They get pressed into doing jobs that they would rather be doing something else. We can all resonate with that.
Yes. Yeah.
So if you're trying to, if you're struggling, when you say, how do we heal? What are you talking about? What do you want to heal from, Lindsay? Or just give us some examples. I'm not saying you, but what do you think
Right.
we,
Well, I
like
guess
what?
it's just, yeah, I guess how do people be able to, I guess I guess what I'm looking for is how do we walk through that darkness when we've been traumatized and feel like those things are not going to destroy us? Because when we experience trauma, we disconnect because we disconnect for a reason, because it was so painful we couldn't handle it, right? So it was like a death. It's a fragmentation. Sometimes I think those fragmentations, like you're saying, can go off and cause chaos, cause addiction, cause these negative mantras that people say, or infinitum, like that could be translated into lots of different ways of how it's used against us, even though it's trying to get our attention to heal itself, I think. And I think that can be very frightening for people. My own experiences of, walking through some of the trauma that I past experienced, it feels like another mini death because it was so painful that I disconnected so much that I was no longer in my body. Another aspect of myself took over to handle that moment. And, and because you're not only just going through that memory, but it's also what you did or what you've done to maybe mask that memory or to compensate and deal with that memory. And, that's a huge spectrum that you could go into. So I guess it's just, how are you cultivating faith? Like, how do you tell somebody it's going to be okay when everything in their life thus far has kind of shown them the opposite, you know? And I know that's a really big question, and we don't have to answer that because I think that's very personal for a lot of people just to experience. But I just really wanted to address it, like
Right.
that it really is hard to walk through your trauma, but ultimately, what is bothering you, what you say, like the devil is torturing you, is also it's information. And it's like it's tuning your receiver to be able to understand the message that's being told instead of it feeling like it's being there, like sent to destroy you. You know?
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, these are really big and
They're big.
potentially heavy subjects. And but like when you talk about it could be addiction or it could manifest an addiction, Dr. Gabor Mate explains that all addiction is a sign of trauma, or so
Right.
is rage. Like
Hmm.
if you're flying off the handle at something that's, you know, like you drop a spoon on the floor as you're emptying the dishwasher and you start going crazy,
Right.
people would say that's a little out of control. When there's something underneath there that is that rage is a sign that there's something underneath. There's some feeling of
It's like a
that's
trigger
being
response.
triggered, right? There's
Yeah.
some kind of trauma that you haven't gotten over that is being represented by that.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that in a second. But so how do you overcome those things that you're like, oh, I wish I wouldn't fly into a rage like that. I wish I wouldn't always come back to this addiction that I have. I wish I wouldn't be such a workaholic or always feel like I'm not measuring up, even though I've done all these things. I still don't feel like I can do anything right, or deep down, even though everybody tells me that you know, when I'm at the dinner banquet where they're giving me my award for CEO of the year, deep down, I'm still feeling like I still can't do anything right. Why is that?
Right.
That's what I think we're trying to address here, and it's deep and big subjects. But let me show you what this book by Dr. Richard Schwartz and Martha Sweezy says that I think is part of the keys to the whole thing and connects to the myths. So I'm going back to sharing the screen again. Is the screen sharing?
I can
I
just
can't tell
unmute.
because it's you. Yeah.
Okay.
All right,
Here we
back
go.
to this. Okay, back
Okay.
to pages 101 and 102. So these parts of us take on these roles that have to do with protecting. So if you have what this is talking about, this language of parts means aspects that show up inside, parts of your personality, parts of who you are that show up that you don't, you're like, why are you doing this? Why, Mr. Rage, are you coming out of nowhere when I drop a spoon on the floor? That didn't make any sense. Why did I do that? And so you can ask, well, what exactly are you doing for me? What is your job? And if it tells you that it's, well, I'm protecting you or I'm doing something, we know something about that part. Its role is protective. Okay, he's talking about getting down to the higher self or the essential self, which is not a part. The self is not one of the parts. But we all have these different aspects of our personality, and they all have potentially positive and unique things that they give to us, and that nobody else has that exact part. But they get stuck in these roles because of protecting from trauma, protecting from pain. So if it has a job, we know that it's a protector of some sort. He calls them protectors. If it doesn't have a job, an astute person would say, wait a minute, what if it doesn't have a job? Then it's an exile. That's something different. That's like someone that's part of you that's not being allowed to play on the team, like the kid who doesn't get picked for the kickball team, like the
Yeah,
exile.
somebody left out. Yeah.
It's still part of you. It's doing a job, but its job is to carry some ancient burden from your past, and
Yeah.
nobody wants to talk to it. It's like, get away from me with that shame that you've got from when you were a child, or get away from me with that fear that you've got, or that
I think,
pain.
yeah, the rejection.
So there's exiles that are carrying this burden, and then there's these protectors that are keeping that exile out of sight. Like, whoa. So the protectors keep the exile out of sight by two ways. It can be, and these are all, I'm taking this basically direct quotes. I've just arranged them in kind of a pattern on the page. This is basically a direct quote from pages 101 and 102. The protectors can either be proactive, running around to make sure the exile with its bag of pain or bag of shame or backpack full of wounds that it's carrying doesn't show up on the playground. So he's running around keeping that exile away, suppressing. It's a workaholic. It's like, well, if I work real hard, that exile, I won't have to deal with that exile. If I please other people, doing kind of, the things that we see people doing, things that
Right.
we catch ourselves doing. It's either
Yeah.
proactive or reactive. When the exile does show up, oh my goodness, there's that exile with a bag of my ancient trauma from when I was wounded, shamed, in great fear, in great trauma. I've got to do something to take everyone's eyes off of that exile. That's when a reactive manager comes in, a reactive protector will come into, that's an addiction. Like, oh, I better take a hit of this substance. Oh, I better fly into a rage because that exile showed up. Rage will get that exile back into the cave. That's like a reaction. It's already
Right.
shown up. So if I
Yeah.
drop that spoon and it triggers that my mom or my dad always said, you're never going to amount to anything, you're no good at anything. And I still, somewhere deep inside me is carrying that I still believe it. I can't do anything right. I may be emptying the dishwasher and I drop a spoon and I've got all these accomplishments, but in that moment, the little exile comes up with a backpack full of you can't do anything right. And rage comes in and goes,
Yeah.
see, it's reacting. So he calls the first one, the proactive one, a manager, and he calls the reactive one a firefighter. Like addictions and rages are firefighters. Rage is a firefighter. Self-harm is a firefighter. Cutting
Yeah.
yourself, that's a way of taking. It's like, oh my goodness, that exile showed up. Let me cut myself to take all the energy into a different direction, away from
Yeah,
that
you have to
exile.
transform that. Yeah, you have to
And a
transform the
manager,
energy so it's anything but whatever is coming up.
right? That's right. So it can be anything that blows off steam, which could be sex, it could be a substance, and all those things aren't, sex and alcohol aren't bad things, but if they're used in this reactive way, that's when it's because of trauma. That's when you become an alcoholic, or that's when you become addicted. Is
Right.
okay. So he says the managers they're motivated by fear. They're all trying to avoid pain. The managers are running around trying to keep the exiles from showing up. That's workaholic. That's pleasing people. That's I've got to have my I've got to look just right. I've got to have my makeup just perfect, or my clothes just right, or I've got to have my life in order, or whatever. And then the reactors, the firefighters, they're on the other end. They're reactive rather than proactive. They distract from the overwhelming feelings that have already arisen. And then he says, or they say, two really important things. They're all motivated by fear of pain.
Yeah, for sure. Man, yeah, I mean, just that resonates just within me. I can, um, we kind of become these micromanagers within ourselves, but then I can also like burn it all down to the ground, and have in the past in like
Right.
half a
That's the,
day.
that's
It
right.
doesn't take me a whole week to just
That's right.
destroy everything and just sometimes, and then we can get, I think, addicted in those cycles, because if we were born in chaos and part of our survival is this hypervigilism, and then that becomes like the only way we can kind of control a situation is to set ourselves up for it and activate it, then we know what's coming. I think that that can be another component exactly in what you're talking about. It's just, yeah. And
That,
then you
and,
gotta
and
kind of, you're just stuck in this like rut of chaos.
and what you said is really important, because the next line is, they're usually polarized. These managers usually work in pairs. So you just said, I can be this micromanager, but then, something happens and I just burn it all down.
Yeah.
It's like they're polarized with another part. So a manager can be polarized with a firefighter. Like, if, my workaholism can, when that doesn't work, then I go on a drinking binge. Or it can also be another manager that are fighting with each other, like my workaholism and my, please otherism can sometimes get into conflict with each other, because my job is getting in the way of me trying to please my, I don't know, parents or something. I don't know. So they can polarize, which is just what we were just talking about with the pictures in the Bible, and these polarized parts can tear us apart. And
Mm-hmm.
so how do you fix it? And they talk about it in IFS and in other psychological healers like Dr. Peter Levine or Dr. Gabor Mate and many others. The
You take a lot of psychedelics. I'm just
Well, and they would argue, and Dr. Gabor Mate, not to put words in his mouth, but he talks about that uh, uh, mushrooms or psychedelic mushrooms or ayahuasca can help reveal the self.
Yeah,
That's so it says here, and I
I
put it in
totally agree
green,
with that and have experienced that for sure.
the self is the one that can heal the parts. Not
Mm-hmm.
so these the managers and firefighters cannot heal other parts. All they can do is they're carrying out this role that they've been forced into. They can't actually fix the role. The one that can heal them is the self. They're unlikely to change. So the manager, so what they talk about in this book is, you can't just use willpower to, oh, I'm never going to get mad. Oh, I'm never going to have another drinking binge. I mean, that's what we're told to do, but that doesn't actually fix the problem. And you're
Right.
actually not going to get, the manager and the firefighter are not going to change their roles until the exile that they're protecting is unburdened. And the one who can do that is not the parts. We just said in the previous line, they can't heal the other parts. It's the one that's deep down that you've been alienated from. The self is the one who can come in and say, hey, would you like to not be playing that role anymore of, firefighter that's cutting yourself? Would you like to stop doing that? Yes, but I can't, because this is a matter of life and death to them. They believe that the pain was so painful, because when you were a child, it was so painful, it was life and death, that they
Yeah.
have to do this role, uh, or you'll die. So you you can't stop them from doing that until you fix the problem. And the one that can do that is the self. And the myths show this over and over and over. And I'll just show, this is my favorite illustration of it, but it's the easiest, most obvious, I think, illustration of it. One of them, but they're all throughout the myths. But this is one that's familiar in Western culture, that's been infused with the Bible. This is Jesus and, do you know this story?
No.
Oh, it's a story of doubting Thomas. So
Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay.
when Jesus shows up, all the other disciples say, "We've seen the risen Lord," and Thomas says, "I don't believe it." He's doubting. Why is he doubting? He's protecting it. He's doubting because those doubts are a protection from harm. He's like, I'm not going to get burned by that again. It's like the part of you is like, I'm not going to get burned. I got burned too badly by trusting others or whatever.
Or I think there's also this aspect of like getting your hopes up. And I think a lot of children carry that into adultism of like almost self-sabotaging because it's like this
That's right.
undeservingness, you know?
That's right. So that's absolutely right. So Thomas embodies, I would argue, a lot of aspects of protective parts
Mm-hmm.
there. And he's gotten that way because of he's been burned by the world. And
Right.
I would argue and can show tons of evidence that these myths are the higher self, the essential self. Figures such as Jesus and Krishna and the Buddha have to do with are representing or illustrating for us the higher self that's been suppressed, that's been buried. And in
Yeah.
this case, Jesus has come back from the grave, and the protective Thomas says, I don't want to believe that. I don't want to trust that he's let us down, that self. That, he said he was going to lead us to all this stuff, and then he got killed and put underground. But the self is actually immortal. No matter what trauma you've gone through, it's actually never damaged. The
Right.
parts get polarized and the parts get put into these roles. So this is showing the fixing, the reinstatement, the reconciliation. And Jesus, the self, doesn't say to Thomas, oh, you bad part. Oh, he doesn't say, oh, I hate you, you alcoholism or you anger. That's not how he gets him to stop doing what he's doing. He shows love and compassion and says, how have you been hurt? Why are you doubting? Let me help you play a different role. Would you like to stop doubting? Would you like to be someone? Would you like to have you're created to do a different role, but you're doing this role because of this pain. I can go and fix that exile if you let me. The self is the one that can go fix that exile. And so it's actually we end up, that's how you heal. That's how you get in touch with yourself. And the myths are all about that. And, I would say go see a IFS counselor and they can help you get down to those exiles, but it's not them that's going to heal you. It's your own self that's
Right.
been suppressed by those parts. Like the doubting Thomas is like, get back. I don't want to trust that you came up. So
Yeah, and there's such beauty like when you do go through that and you show up for yourself. I don't think there's anything more healing. And, you know, I don't know. I understand like it is a big, complicated subject, but at the same time, the answer really is simple, is we go within to save ourselves, but how that manifests in our lives or whether or not we choose to do it or on what level, because, I actually did a podcast called Spiritual Skepticism because I had a pretty volatile relationship with myself. Now, how much that was related to childhood, I'm sure a lot, but it was also probably the level of empathic energy that I was able to like experience in this planet, because I do feel a lot of things to the point where I remember being young and even seeing somebody go through painful things, such as my family, like it was easier for me to absorb their pain than it was for me to watch them go through it. And I think there was a part of me that had to like decided that I had to do that to survive. But, and then as I got older, that turned. I became like my worst enemy and couldn't handle all of the emotional chaos that was going on inside of me. And it was really difficult for me to even sit with myself because things like, not the devil, but aspects of the fear of this demon that lived inside of me or facing my own self was worse than death, and however that path has unfolded, it has, and it'll continue to unfold, but it's so personal for me. But I feel like a lot of, it's like when we share how we heal ourselves with other people and are able to kind of see people's shadow selves and their light at the same time and understand that that's a whole person. I think that, we go through that trauma, some of us, to be able to assist others in their path of healing, and but it is really ultimately people deciding on what level they're going to do that, you know. Are they going to There was a lot of times where I doubted the whole process and I almost wished that I was just balls to the wall insane so I wouldn't have to be so aware of the craziness that that I was experiencing and the emotional turmoil and like torture in a lot of ways. And but I
Well, and
understand that those are the strongest parts of myself, that those came online to protect me, to get me through what I wasn't able to get through. And even when I do like like chakra classes with people or sound classes with people, I talk about these aspects of these defense mechanisms that we build up that maybe we feel like have turned against us on some level. Even when they fall to addiction, they're helping us. They're going out and getting our drugs for us, They're we're always there's we're always on our side, even at our worst, even in the darkest of times, whatever we're coping with, at least for what I understand for myself and for what I've seen right now, is that's kind of I believe that there is aspects, even the manager and even the reactor, they're on our side, like they're trying to help us, like you said, but it
well,
can
and yes, I
seem very
mean,
confusing.
yeah, for sure. I mean, you said a lot of good things right there. So the John the Baptist figure, who is a bit of a wild man. I mean, people say he lives out in the wilderness. He's wearing camel, a camel skin with a belt around his waist and eating locusts and wild honey. And at one point they even say he has a devil, or Jesus says, you looked at John and he didn't eat or drink anything, and you said he has a devil, and now I come eating and drinking wine, and you call me a glutton. Um, so point being that John himself was a bit of a wild man
Hmm.
out in the wilderness, but he's pointing to the self and the higher self, the one to come, Jesus, who I'm arguing is the higher self, and he's saying he must increase, I must decrease. Or the more we get in touch with the higher self, then actually all those parts can become unburdened to play the roles that they're actually supposed to be playing. But it's a
Yeah.
self, they all want that self to 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 lead, but they've been burned in the past, so they don't trust him, like doubting Thomas. They don't trust, or we don't trust ourselves, or we're like, where were you when I needed you most during that trauma? And the self got buried, and we got separated from the self. But so I would argue that, or I would offer, I think meditation is, and I don't
Yeah.
do it every day. I do it when I get up early enough to do it in the complete darkness, like before the sun has come up.
Right.
And when it's totally dark, you can sit and you can go down into your all the different parts on your team and say, "Hey, how are you doing?" You can talk to the one that is the rage one, the
Yeah.
addiction one, and you can put the more you can do that, you can put the reins in the hand of the self. That's the one you really want steering your chariot, to use a different metaphor that we didn't talk about from the Bhagavad Gita. But the reins are held in the Bhagavad Gita by Krishna, who's the divine twin in that role, just like Jesus is the divine twin with Thomas the twin.
Hmm.
Um, so the um, I think that's the path to healing, is like understanding this, and it's not an instant thing. It's a long process, and probably getting help from If you've been traumatized, getting help from someone who's like an expert in IFS would be a great idea to check out. But really,
Right.
it's your own self. Ultimately, hopefully, if you go to an IFS counselor, they'll be one who's telling you that it's yourself, or is enabling yourself to heal those parts. And
Well, I agree with you about meditation. Like I do a lot of sound, and I mean, a sound isn't just sound. It's mantras and chant work and a lot of toning and instruments, but a lot of it's like we make sound to raise our vibration so we can hear clarity. And then working like, I work with the chakras a lot, and it's like clearing out your throat chakra so you can not only speak your truth, but you can hear the truth.
hmm,
But these are all bridgeways, and a lot of times we want to connect with the divine, but if we don't have a structure like our root structure, and we don't have a connection to the planet we live on or the body we live in, it's very difficult to build. And I mean, I even see that in, biblical stories is, you need a rock. That to me is like your root chakra. You have to be grounded, and then you can handle like your emotions. And instead of it becoming like the ocean of emotion where you feel like you're drowning, it becomes calm, and you can release a lot of those things and stand on this structure of, whether you want to call it God or Jesus or your root chakra, Mother Earth, the constellations. I think that it's really, I love just how like versatile all of this information is in so many ways. I can see it in so many things, like so many abstract connections, and I really appreciate that. I just think it's brilliant, and I think that through all of these journeys with ourselves, we realize we're brilliant. The stories that are in the stars, like that's our story, that's our brilliance, like shining above us. That's within us. We're shining, and sometimes we are out in the wilderness wearing weird shit, and maybe you gotta like when you said the honey, I was like, oh, he's tripping on shrooms. Like maybe you gotta go out and do some self exploration, and I'm not saying anybody do anything, because I feel like you need that some sort of a safety structure, some sort of a grounding, and some balance. And you can argue all day long of why you can't do that, why you're not able to do that. But ultimately, those are still excuses. Like you can, it's within you. You have the ability. That doesn't mean it's easy. It just means that it's there, and it's always ready for you in the information that you can process in the time that it unfolds, which is also very brilliant. It's
yeah, that's right. No, I think the connection to the cosmos and the divine comes through the connection with the self. So the more we're connected to the self, then, and the less we're polarized, the less we have these polarized relationships, as we can get those relationships reconciled. And the only way to do it is by, if you go back to that slide of healing the exiles,
yeah.
which the only one who can heal those is the self, not the managers, not the firefighter. You can't say, hey, I'm going to will myself to
Oh yeah, they're
be
freaking
less of a
out.
this. But that polarization, what you were also mentioning earlier about, in the world, when we come across someone who's really polarized from us, if we're in our polarized parts, our protective parts, we're going to, be,
Agitated at them.
yeah, they're going to
Yeah.
trigger us. They're going
How
to make
dare
us,
you annoy me with your trauma?
but if,
You're
right, but if
triggering my trauma.
the more we're connected, the more we're being led by self, the more we can say, what happened to that person? Or I wonder what they're afraid of, that they're so clinging so tightly to this political position that triggers me, or that they're being so horrendous with this thing that they just said. What is it? That's a protective thing that they just did. The more you're out of those polarized, the more you've healed those within yourself, the more you're able to connect with others, I think. And defuse those polarizations. So, and that's something that Dr. Schwartz talks about and other healers talk about too. So,
I totally
yeah.
agree with that. Well, I don't want to take up any more of your time, even though I literally could talk to you forever. Like, this is fascinating to me, and I just feel like, it can go in so many different directions, but it's still very powerful, I think, in any aspect that you apply this to your life, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Well, we got to the
And
last slide. We got there. That's all I
yeah, all
have.
right, we did it.
I think those were three great topics, and I hope that they tied together in a way that makes some sense to people who are watching. And I really
Well, I
commend
think
you
it's
for
really
bringing those up.
beautiful.
Yeah, it was
I,
great,
it
great
was great. I
choices.
really appreciate it.
Great.
So thank you. Hey, how can people reach out to you? Why don't you say, tell us where your website is before I stop the recording?
Okay, let me show it. I've got it right here.
Yeah, all
Wasn't my
your
last. There's my last slide. I've
your
got.
your website is incredible, by the
Thank
way.
you.
It's really
Well, there's a
beautiful.
lot in there. It's been. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So there's the URL. I put spaces just so it's easy to see. You don't put spaces when you type it in, or
Right.
you can find me there on Instagram and YouTube. I've got a bunch of videos, but all those videos are on the website as well. Um, so
Yeah,
that
I've
is,
been on your
that's
website. It has a lot of information. It's like a library, really, which is amazing. And um, so I'm very appreciative of that. And it's also information that's very clear and concise and really easy to understand, even for people that don't necessarily know much about constellations or star systems or even mythology. I think that that's really the beauty of your message, is that it's really translatable, for even anybody. Because,
Thank you.
yeah,
Yeah,
no,
I
thank
totally
you.
agree. I think these ancient myths were given to all people. I mean, we can see that all cultures have these ancient myths, so they are for everybody and they're
Yeah,
for our benefit. Every culture has these. They're not supposed to be kept, I don't think,
hidden.
to just a small group who controls them. They were given to all cultures and they're an ancient treasure. They're an inheritance for all people and they're for our benefit and blessing in this life, is what I like to say. So thank you very much for allowing me to spread that message on your
Thank
podcast
you.
and website, Lindsay.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for
So I'm going to stop
asking us great
recording and then,
questions. Yeah, great.
okay.